No. No, there's always been limitations on what they're allowed to say. I mean, why don't you go to Molière and Louis XIV? I mean, Molière had to be a bit careful. And there have always been limitations. I mean, in England, until some ridiculous late date like 1965, all plays had to be submitted to what used to be a part of the palace called the Lord Chamberlain. He would read it, and there were hilarious letters used to go backwards saying, you may only say once. This sort of letter. And you cannot say bugger, but you can say this sort of ridiculous negotiating letters. So there have always been it, but I think it's particularly worrying at the moment because you can only create in an atmosphere of freedom where you're not checking everything you say critically before you move on. What you have to be able to do is to build without knowing where you're going, because you've never been there before. That's what creativity is. So you have to be allowed to build. And a lot of comedians now are sitting there, and when they think of something, they start thinking, could I get away with that? I don't think so. So-and-so got into trouble when he said that or she said that. You see what I mean? And that's the death of creativity. So you find that comedians start moving into what sort of safe areas, like you can't really get cancelled these days for anything to do with sex, whereas that's exactly what you would have got cancelled for in the 60s. You see what I mean? It's as though human beings want to have some things that you absolutely mustn't do and other things that are all right, and they just change every 25 years. So I would say at the moment this is a difficult time, particularly for young comedians, but you see my audience is much older, and they're simply not interested in most of the woke attitudes. I mean, they just think that you should try and be kind to people, and that's no need to complicate it. You know. Well, disastrous. I mean, comedians having to think, well, can I say this or not? You know, that once you start checking everything, it's very hard to be very creative because you can't build on anything without thinking. You see, the moment that the critical mind comes in, you stop being creative. They're definitely in opposition to each other. You can do the creation and then criticize it, but you can't do them at the same time. So if you're worried about offending people and constantly thinking of that, you are not going to be very creative. So I think it has a disastrous effect. Well, everything is more politicized now. I mean, it wasn't like this when I first got to America. When I first got to America in the 60s, I mean, two things happened. First of all, I very much admired the cross the aisle friendships and thought we don't have that in England. We have real battles between the Tories and the Labour. But in America, there seem to be these, and this was destroyed by Newt Gingrich, quite deliberately for purposes of power. I think that's a tragedy. But you're quite right that when you look at Colbert now, whom I adore, the audience is more obviously politically aligned than it used to be, but it's true everywhere. I think Canadians can sometimes summarize in a moment what's happening very well, but I don't think they ever change anything. Peter Cook used to have a wonderful routine about those brilliant Berlin cabarets that did so much to stop Hitler from rising to power. No, I think you should allow audiences to. I mean, if you go to a Republican convention and tell anti-Democrat jokes, you'll get a very good response. If you tell anti-Republican jokes, you won't. So you've got to fit your material to some extent to your audience, and that's part of it. I mean, if you go to see your granny for a week or a day, if you go to see your granny, and to have tea with her, you don't start telling her sex jokes. Now, that's not because it's illegal, it's just bad manners. So I think you think what the audience is, and then you might shock them a little bit, because that's fun. And also, as I point out on stage, if you get into areas that are a little bit taboo, you actually get the biggest laughs, which is why sexual humor is often greeted with huge laughs when it's not particularly funny. It's to do with anxiety and the release of anxiety when people relax or laugh with spare energy that comes from the fact that they've just laughed at something they've been anxious about before. I think the great sadness now for me is that there are very, very few really good comedy scripts. And I think there used to be. Certainly in England, when I went to the theatre between the 60s and 2000, there were probably 6 or 7 writers writing absolutely wonderful comedies, beautifully constructed, good characters. And I think this was true in America too, because Broadway was all important and the people working on Broadway were very literate. They wrote a great deal and they knew how to plot. What I feel now is that very few people understand how to plot comedy. So the comedies in America are really aimed at young men because they're the ones who go to the cinema on Friday night, which means that the box office looks good. And it's all down ultimately to money, because we're now have studios that are more interested in money than in making great movies. And in the old days, they wanted to make great movies too. Roxanne. Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. I don't go to comedies much, because when you spend your life in comedy, the time you get to 55 years in comedy, you have heard most of the jokes, and you watch people, you think, yeah, that's funny, but I have better things to do this evening than watch comedy. I don't need to be entertained. I'd rather read a book.